take it away.
Thank you, Corey, for the gracious introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out here on a beautiful July day in Wyoming to hear about some science and allow me to share my research with you, and thanks to everyone joining us on Zoom. So I will get going. But at the outset, I also wanted to acknowledge that the work I'm presenting today is not just mine. It's collaborative work with many of my current and former students, some of whom are here today, and collaborators from a variety of different places. And our work is funded by federal sources, but also I acknowledge the Draper Museum and the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation for the Camp Monaco Prize. And of course, Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks and our surrounding national forests. So I'm going to start with something that I think everybody can agree on, whether you're here in this room or you're in other places around the world, and that is that Yellowstone is just such a special place. And people come from all over to see the unique thermal features like Old Faithful or Grotto or the hot springs, so many things to view. The beautiful scenery that we have throughout the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and of course the wildlife. So it is a really unique place, and I need to speak into the microphone. Thank you. Tell me if I'm doing anything else. I'm good with this. But I think one of the other reasons Yellowstone is really special is that sometimes we don't realize it's one of the largest intact temperate landscapes in the world. So as you know, it's centered on Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. We're here in Cody, just out to the east of the GYE, and it's surrounded by wilderness areas and national forests and also private lands as well. But together, it's one of the largest places that has an intact flora and fauna relative to other places. In terms of the vegetation, forests form the backbone of the GYE. So many of you are familiar with the lodgepole, whoops, gotta go on the bottom. The lodgepole pine forests that occupy most of the middle elevations of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. We have spruce fir forests up at the higher elevations, and at the lower elevations, lower montane, we have Douglas fir and aspen. So forests are really fundamental to this entire system. This includes areas like from up high on the Shoshone National Forest, where we look at areas of rugged terrain, as well as the continuous, gently rolling plateaus of central Yellowstone, where you see these, this is off of Dunraven Pass, but you see the continuous conifer forests that extend for miles. Now, Greater Yellowstone is also a landscape that is shaped by fire. So historically, infrequent, meaning they return at about intervals of 100 to 300 years, infrequent but high-severity fires, we call them stand replacing because they kill the current group of trees and they initiate the establishment of a new cohort. So 100 to 300 year fire return intervals have occurred in this system for the past 10,000 years. So we know that from work that is based on tree rings and also pollen and charcoal cores, so the paleo work done by people like Kathy Whitlock at Montana State, or Bill Rami, recently retired from Colorado State University. Another important thing about this region and about Northern Rockies forests in general is that the fires are driven by climate. So you need the hot, dry conditions that allow the fuels to burn. They're not usually limited by fuels. We have plenty of fuel on the landscape with the tree needles and the wood and it's just there all the time. But what's not typically been there in the past very often is the climate conditions that are associated with the big fires. Now, the other thing that I think is kind of fun is I'm just telling you fire is not new, but it's not frequent. But even the early explorers recognized the role of fire in Yellowstone. So this is just one sample from the diary of Nathaniel Langford, who was the first superintendent of Yellowstone as part of the Washburn expedition, talking about being along the Firehole River and breaking camp and walking along the Firehole and passing through a long stretch of fallen timber blackened by fire for about 4 miles. And because Bill Rami had done the fire history work throughout central Yellowstone, we know that was likely a fire that burned in 1862. So it's been a part of the landscape for a very long time. Nonetheless, how many of you remember the 1988 fires? I know, so many of you in the room. I was chatting with several of you ahead of time. But nonetheless, the 1988 fires were rather a surprise because in recent history, especially throughout the 20th century, we just hadn't seen big fires like this. So you may remember the news every night, the television telling us how Yellowstone had been destroyed by the fires. It was just, you couldn't escape the news no matter where you were in the country. So anyone who remembers that summer remembers that quite well. And at the end, I sometimes like to say that these are actually color photos, even though they look black and white. But I took this one in October of 1988, and it looked pretty devastated, I gotta say. Everything was black, there was very little green anywhere. Any of you who drove through the park during that time period, it was just miles and miles of blackened timber. And so I would say the size and the severity of the fires were really a shock, both to scientists and to resource managers and to the general public, to all of us at the time. It was exceptionally dry and windy. When I was here in July of 1988, we couldn't go up in a small plane, even though I was with other scientists, because there were 60-mile-an-hour winds and they couldn't fly. It was not caused by historical fire suppression. That's a misconception that persists to this day. This is not a region that's like the ponderosa pines in the southern, southwest portion of the country. It was the exceptionally dry and windy conditions. We always have lightning in this region, so we have sources of ignition. And the fires burned forests of all ages and structures. So conventional wisdom that I was told prior to that time is that the fires would only burn the old forest, because that's what had been observed in the 1972 to 1987 time window. So this photograph is one of mine, but it shows this area that burned. So I took this from a helicopter in October of '88, but the fires even crossed the canyon of the Yellowstone. So much like the fires that were jumping the rivers in California, so the Camp Fire that burned Paradise and others, they're lofted by burning embers that go very long distances, often 1 to 2 miles ahead of the flaming front. So it was a shock at the time, I gotta say. And in terms of the science, we had a whole lot of questions. So what were going to be the ecological effects of such a large and such a severe fire? We actually thought maybe the soils were sterilized. We didn't know if the ground was gonna be suitable for trees to come back or other organisms. We didn't know whether the forest would come back. We didn't know how long it would take. And we thought maybe invasive species would take over, because that's common after many anthropogenic disturbances. So we had a lot of questions that launched a lot of long-term research. So this is me standing in front of the helicopter that took me over the fires in October of 1988, when we had a chance, and they were still smoking, but they were largely going out at that time period. And this now, you see pictures like this all the time, but we didn't realize that the fires create such a complex spatial pattern. It's kind of like a patchwork quilt or a mosaic on the landscape, where you have these areas where the fires burned through the canopy and they consumed all the fine needles. You have areas at the edge, these brown halos, where the trees were killed, but it wasn't hot enough to consume everything. So the needles are still there and the cones are still there. And then you have islands of these unburned patches that are well within it. So when you get a bird's eye view looking down, it's not nearly as monolithic. It's not as much of a moonscape. And that doesn't underestimate the size of the fires. These were really big and really severe, but very complex in terms of the patterning that they establish on the landscape. We started our fieldwork. This is our friends and family summer of 1989 field research team. Like, my husband is in the middle here. My mom even came out that summer. This is Bill Rami, if any of you know him, in the background there. But we started our fieldwork to try to understand the effects of the fires the very following summer. And then I've been continuing to work out here ever since then. So some of the things that we learned from the '88 fires. One was that the vegetation recovered really rapidly, much more so than we expected. So I keep hitting the top button for the pointer. Here's a baby lodgepole pine seedling establishing the year right after the fires, even though it looked like that black and white picture in the fall. The herbaceous vegetation, the wildflowers and the grasses, many of them resprouted. They flowered profusely in 1990. If any of you drove around the park, you would have seen a ton of color in the burned areas. And by the time we were at 15 years later, so this is 2003, that's my son actually in the corner there, who was a little guy at the time, but we see many, many of these trees coming back throughout the burned area. We also found that it was the native plants that recovered quickly. And in contrary to my question about were the soil sterilized, the fires, even though they're really severe, they don't burn very deeply into the soil. And so here's some lupins that we had excavated. And these are seedlings, and they still have their little cotyledons, the little baby leaves that they put on when they germinate. But these plants resprouted from roots that survived the fire. And what happened is in 1989, many of the grasses and wildflowers resprouted, and then the following year they flowered, and the following year their seedlings were filling in. So the native species all filled in really well and surprisingly quickly. We did not see invasive species take over throughout this area. The abundant regeneration of lodgepole pine is really striking. I mean, now I'll show another picture, but as you drive through the park, you just see miles and miles of young trees. And this is because lodgepole has a canopy seed bank. So it has a special kind of cone. They're called serotinous cones, and they remain closed, and they store up seed year after year after year. And when those cones are warmed, as happens with a fire, they open, and the seeds fall to the surface, and they like having that exposed mineral soil and all the sunshine, and the tree is just adapted to grow back. We did learn that the presence of those kinds of cones varies across the landscape, so there's differences in how dense the forest is when it comes back. But here's an area that just shows you can see it was a dense forest beforehand, because you can see the wood, and you can see all the trees coming in. So the lodgepole pines regenerated, came back in spades. And this picture is from the Nice Creek Trail looking across the Madison River, looking south, right near 7 Mile Bridge, for those of you familiar with the area. And I think this was taken 25 years after the fire. These are tall trees that survived in '88, but all that you can see here, this vibrant green, is all post-fire forest that recovered after 1988. So these were not an ecological catastrophe, despite what we thought. And in fact, we learned that the Greater Yellowstone forests are very well adapted to their historical fire regime. I got to work with National Geographic a few years ago to put together this illustration showing the transition from these severely burned areas all the way through these dense forests that we have across the landscape now. However, things are changing a little bit now. So even though I said this is a landscape shaped by fire, the fire regime, or that return interval and such of the fire, it's now changing. And so that's what I'm going to tell you a little bit about more right now. If any of you haven't seen it, the Greater Yellowstone Climate Assessment just came out a couple of years ago. It's excellent, very good summary for how climate is changing in this region. But what we're seeing is that the climate is getting both warmer and also drier. Since 1950, our atmospheric CO2 levels are higher than any time they have been in the past 3.3 million years. Temperatures are hotter than they have been at any time in the past 20,000 years. And in Yellowstone, the growing season is already 2 weeks longer than it used to be. That means fire season is 2 years longer as well, if you think of it that way. So our mean annual temperature has already gone up. And this is just data. This isn't looking forward. I thought I had an, oops, no, I don't. So as we look forward, however, and these are from the Greater Yellowstone Climate Assessment, there's just a couple things that I'll show you here as we look to what the projections are toward the end of the century. So these maps here, in the top panel here, are showing the number of days that are below freezing in the GYE each year. So you can just, these are the same panels, and these are the same panels for drought in the summer. As we go forward, it's the change in the number of days below freezing as we go toward the end of the century. And the redder it gets, the fewer days there are. So the top panel shows if our emissions are under control by mid-century, we will get warmer. But if we stay on the course that we're on, we'll get really much warmer. So many, many fewer days below freezing. Similar situation if we think about, this is May, June, July, August, September. So growing season or fire season, drought is a measure. And so again, the redder we get, the droughtier it would get at the end of the century. And again, if we stay on the course we're at, drier. If we stabilize things by mid-century, somewhat less. So keep that in mind as we go forward. And this is really important with regard to fire and forests, because the drier it gets, the more the area is burned each year. And so that's what we're seeing throughout the West for these recent, say the past 10 years, when you think about the numbers of fires throughout the Western US. This graph is showing the dryness of the fuel and then the area burned in the West. And you can see it doesn't go up linearly. So it means a little bit more drought can give you a lot more area burned. And the red dots are those that have been since 2000 and beyond, with 2020 way up here. So it's very important in terms of fire, how hot and how dry things get throughout the region. And I like to show this picture because this is the one that really got my attention, because after 20 years of studying the effects of the '88 fires in Yellowstone, we understood that the forests are tremendously resilient, and I expected, we had done a lot of work, that they'll be fine as climate changes, because they've been fine even with the 1988 fires. And my colleague, Tony Westerling, showed this at a meeting we were both presenting at, showing the droughtiness in 1988. And you can see the red means drier conditions. It's centered right on Yellowstone, where we had the big fires. And then this is the projection for later in the century, where not only is it a deeper red, but it's very extensive. And so that meant, like, what happens if climate like 1988 becomes the average conditions, not the extreme? And that was outside the realm that I had really been thinking about. So as we started exploring what that would mean, it meant that we go from historical conditions. This is a cartoon outline of Greater Yellowstone, where the time between fires would have been more than 120 years, like it's been for 10,000 years. And then as we go through the latter part of the century, the weather conditions that could give you big fires start to occur so frequently that they're happening every year. And that means that the weather conditions that could give you big fires like 1988 maybe happen every 20 years or every 30 years. So really, really different than what we've seen since the glaciers retreated. So yikes. Like, what is that going to mean for this system that has adapted to one set of conditions and now may be facing something very different? So then we started asking, well, could this really happen? And then what would it mean for the forests of Greater Yellowstone? Would they still be able to rebound after fire like we saw in 1988? How might forests change? And then what would happen to the native wildlife that depends on the forests? So then it's a little tricky. Forests, as you know, take a long time to develop. So it takes 200 years to grow a full-grown, mature lodgepole pine forest, and we don't have that long to wait. So we don't want to put our heads in the sand, but how do we go about studying this? So tree regeneration is really important because we can't sustain the forests if they can't regenerate. So we wanted to focus on the why and the how, like, so what would change about the ability to rebound after fire? And then we have to use multiple approaches. So continuing long-term studies, like studying the '88 fires, but we study recent fires as well, we do experiments, and then we look at future scenarios also. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of this. So when we're thinking about a warming climate plus fire, and what will that mean, we started thinking about, well, what is necessary for the forest to rebound? And how would it change in the fire regime and the climate change that? So if we had more frequent fires, what would happen if the fires reburned before the trees produce those cones? That would be a key point that would maybe let them recover or not. If we had more severe fires, would we maybe combust more seeds so that we didn't have as many to reestablish? What if the fires got really big and some of the species that have to disperse in couldn't get into the middle? So that would be another thing that would happen. And then once the seeds are there, if we have really dry conditions, can they germinate? You think about planting seeds in your garden, you need to really pay attention to watering them and to the conditions that they're growing in. So we then also had the 2016 fires. So how many of you were around for berry and maple in Buffalo? Yeah, so we had the 2016 fires, which burned the second largest area in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem since 1988. But the surprising thing about those is they burned about 50,000 acres of young forest that isn't supposed to reburn because it's young. It was less than 30 years old. So this is a Park Service picture of the maple fire burning through the young lodgepole pines, kind of like the ones that I showed you across the Madison River, but this is now north of the Madison River. And this picture is in the berry fire in Grand Teton. So this is taken from up high on a ridge, looking down towards the Snake River drainage, so looking down towards the John D. Rockefeller Parkway. And again, these are trees that came back after the 1988 Huck fire, and they reburned, and the same thing happened in the Glade fire of 2000. They reburned in the berry. So now we had an example of like what happens if we change the fire interval so much. So we began studying those in 2017, and this is an interesting contrast. This is in the berry fire where it burned old forests, so like the typical historical fire would be. All this green that you see here are the little baby trees, so the young lodgepole pines, and so that's doing the same thing that we saw in 1988. And this is where it reburned the little short trees that were only growing back after the Glade fire. And here, you don't see any trees. So what we found in both of the maple and the berry fires is we had about 80% reduced regeneration of the little trees after those fires that occurred in such a short time interval. And there's several reasons for that related to what I showed you initially. One is there were a lot fewer seeds because those trees were not producing cones yet, or if they had them, they were not producing the special cones that stay sealed because they were too young to do that. We also found more severe fires than we had seen in 1988, and that was eye-opening to me as well. So you have dense, this is a very dense stand, but you have dense young trees burning in the fire, and in some places, that's what it looked like. That was not what I saw in 1988. You'll see there's no dead logs on the ground. You see these, we call these ghost logs, these white shadows. That's where the logs that had been down on the ground were combusted. And the little trees were completely burned. Now that didn't happen everywhere, but it happened in all of those short interval fires in different places. So we did have combustion of whatever seed there would have been. And then we also had less seed dispersal because the surrounding areas were also little short trees. So they didn't have a lot of cones, and they're really short. So if you drop a paper airplane from this high versus out the second story window, they go different distances. So we had all of those mechanisms that I talked about happening in these fires. And this is consistent with what we've seen in other short interval fires throughout the region. These are not the only ones. This, I'll show you a video in a moment from where the Iron Mountain fire of 1990, this is up on Custer Gallatin, was reburned in 2006. Parts of it were reburned in the Derby fire. If you look down from above, the areas that came back after the 1990 fire, dense trees just like you would see. And now we'll take a little drone view throughout this. And you'll see this sharp line along here where you see very few trees coming back on the right. That's where the fire interval was really short. And where it did not reburn, you see that historical recovery, that resilience that we've seen previously. So we're seeing this trend in quite a few of the other fires that are now starting to burn again in a short amount of time before the forest has really been able to recover. And you can see this goes, it's fairly extensive. So then the other thing that we did was, that's the effect of seeds, because you need those to regrow the forest. But the other thing is the effect of climate, not during the year of the fire, but during the time period that the seeds have to germinate and grow. So two of my former students, Winslow Hansen and Tyler Hecker, both conducted experiments on this. So in Winslow's work, we planted seeds locally sourced, collecting them from the trees in the region in areas where we have current climate in a burned forest, and we have them in areas where the climate today matches what we projected for 2050, so for mid-century. And then Tyler was planting the seeds in areas of short interval fire, so these more recent fires. But we're focused now not on whether they're seeds, because we're planting them. It's if the seeds get there, can they grow? And so what we found, in essence, is that in a hot, dry, post-fire climate, we get 70 to 90% less tree seedlings establishing, assuming the seeds got there, than we would in the the cooler conditions. So that's true for the climate alone in mid-century, and it's also in the hot, dry conditions in the short interval fires. So a big reduction in establishment. And I would say it's kind of a double whammy in the short interval fires, because this is one of the short interval fires in the maple up near, this is Cougar Meadow in the background, for those of you who know, along the Nice Creek Trail. And you can see everything is exposed. Whereas in a long interval fire, all those standing dead trees, they actually do provide surprising amount of shade that keeps the soil cooler and moister. So we have sort of an interactive effect in reducing the amount of forest that can recover. So then this leads us to say, still, what lies ahead? It takes a long time to grow the forest. And so as we look to the future, what do we expect? So we're thinking about this in two ways. One is that we're seeing novel or very different disturbance regimes than we've seen for 10,000 years. And so we can think about that where this green area in the circle represents the frequency or the severity or the size of disturbances that are typical for the past 10,000 years. And then as they become less typical, they become more unusual. The system is not as well adapted to it. So if we're seeing new kinds of frequencies or sizes of severities, and then we're seeing novel ecological responses where the system is responding, the forest is responding differently. If we have both of those things happening, so we have novel disturbances and we have novel responses, that's an opportunity for the system to really reorganize, or basically change. So the forest may change a lot given that we have both things happening. But again, as we deal with the fires of the future and we look across our landscapes, what do we think will happen and how do we assess that? There's a lot of pieces of the puzzle to put together, and the way we approach this is by exploring future scenarios using computer simulation models. And so when I say scenarios, I mean they're plausible futures. These are not forecasts, these are not predictions. I'm not gonna say in 2079, this is what will happen. It's more like, in a sense, if you think about hurricane maps, you know, and they give you lots of different trajectories, we're looking at lots of different outcomes given the same weather conditions. So this work is in collaboration with my colleague Rupert Seidel, who is a scientist in Germany. And so for this approach, what we did was take 5 different areas that are representative of the conditions of Greater Yellowstone. So I have the map shown here, just to give you placement. You can see Yellowstone Lake and Jackson Lake here. So we have a northern Yellowstone landscape that goes from lower to upper tree line, right near Slough Creek in that vicinity. The western Yellowstone landscape over here, lots of lodgepole pine out near West Yellowstone. The Two Ocean Plateau, beautiful area, headwaters of the Snake River, lots of spruce fir forests, so not a lot of the lodgepole pines. Grand Teton National Park, which has lots of our different forest types, and the Grays River District down on the Bridger Teton National Forest. So we're trying to span the types of conditions that are there and represent the dominant tree species. And just to give you an example, I'm not going to show you too many graphs or anything, but to show you what we work with, these are maps. This happens to be the western Yellowstone landscape and the Two Ocean Plateau landscape. And we pay attention to what forest species are there, what are the dominant trees, how old is the forest. And so the pink areas show you places that burned in 1988. That's why they're young. So we represent the actual ages of the forest, the density of the trees, basal area is just an indicator of how much tree biomass there is. You can think of it that way. And also how much carbon is stored in that forest. So we're paying attention to those things. And then we're looking at future climate scenarios, potential projections of fire, and then we simulate what's happening to the forest as we go forward. Lots of details over here. I would be happy to talk with you if you have questions. When we represent fire, it's important that the fires that we simulate on the computer are sensitive to climate and also sensitive to fuels, because both of those things are very important. So the climate conditions give us the timing, like when, what year do we have fires, and the location and the biggest size that they can grow. But then the fuels determine how the fire spreads in the simulation and how it's shaped and what the severity is. In terms of ecological responses, we're paying attention to the forest. So how much forest is there? How old is it? What's its structure? What's the dominant tree species? How much carbon is there? We look at post-fire regeneration of the trees, because that's, again, fundamental to keeping forests on these landscapes. And then what about the wildlife that depend on those forests as well? So I'll touch a little bit on each of these. In terms of future fires, important point here, this is, whenever you see this RCP 4.5, this is from the IPCC future climate models, and that refers to we get control of emissions of carbon by mid-century and they stabilize. So it's a warm but not a hot scenario. And these are the hotter ones where things kind of stay on the track that they're on. And then moisture varies as well. So key point here is if the climate warms, but precipitation continues to really increase as we go along, especially in the summer, the fire regime stays pretty similar to historical as you go forward. Unfortunately, that is not consistent with the current climate trends throughout the West, because we're not seeing increases in precipitation that keep up with the temperature. The temperature is driving the drought. So when we have dry future conditions, you can see increased fire activity as we hit mid-century, even if it's warming, not the more extreme conditions, and very high fire activity as we get to the latter part of 2100. And these trends, we don't know exactly where the temperature will go, but these are consistent with the current climate trends and data. So what did we find? I'll show you just a little bit of what the results show from the computer work. And we see that forest declines and the tree species shift. So when you're looking at these pictures, these are the 5 landscapes that I mentioned to you. If you look at just the trend, that's the total area that's occupied by forest. So when you see it go down, it means there's less forest on the landscape. And then the colors are what forest type is out there. So the green, the bright green is lodgepole pine, the blue is Douglas fir, and the purple is spruce fir. So notably, up on Two Ocean Plateau, one of my favorite places, it's so beautiful, we lose a lot of our spruce fir forest. And we lose a lot of forest in general. We even lose what's up there of lodgepole pine. In all of our Yellowstone and northern landscapes, we see a reduction in forest. We do see increases in Douglas fir. Douglas fir is one of those lower montane species, so it can handle a little bit drier conditions. And the place that we don't see a lot of change is that Grays River area, which is an interesting location, and we have some ideas for why that's happening, and one of my students who's here will be exploring that in the future. So we see changes in the types of forest, but also quite a lot of decline in the amount. And if you look, just this is Two Ocean Plateau as an example here for the maps. If you were to look at this on a map, if we have that warm versus hot scenario, at least we see pink here, which means we do have some forest, even if it's young. Where we see the grayish area, that's where forests can't recover under the very much hotter scenarios. And again, if you see more green, it's more trees, more biomass, less, more carbon, less. So there is a difference in how extreme the changes in the forest may be as we look to the future. There's also a lot of variation among the landscapes in terms of where we see resilience, that ability to rebound. So we have more rugged terrain in the Grays River and northern Yellowstone locations, and those are the places we saw greater ability to maintain forest, less resilient on these gentle central Yellowstone plateaus where we have the continuous forest. So we also focused a lot on post-fire tree regeneration, and I'm going to show you an animation here where you see an outline of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The colors are different tree species, and you're going to see a simulation where red pops up to show fire, and black will show up if the trees can't regenerate. And then there's a graph that shows how that changes as well. So this is an example of a simulation going to 2100. You can see fires occurring at different times. The area burned is going up, and we continue after 2100 because we wait 30 years before we assess whether trees could actually establish. And you'll see there's quite extensive areas throughout the GYE where trees no longer can grow back by the end of the century. And if we put all that together, the redder the area, the higher the likelihood of a failure of the forest to rebound after fire. And again, you can see a lot of that centered on Yellowstone National Park where we have those more gentle, continuous forests. So what does this mean overall? It means we're likely to see old growth forests really diminished, and we'll see young forests throughout the landscape. We'll see areas where trees fail to recover, where there used to be forests, but there won't be in the future. We'll see more young forest reburning, and in some cases, we'll see a conversion of forests to meadows or grasslands. Now, what about the forest wildlife? Because everybody likes wildlife, and I'm not going to talk about large, charismatic mega things like bears and wolves and such, but rather some of the less conspicuous animals that depend a lot on our forests. And so Tyler Hecker in his work focused on the blackback woodpecker, the red squirrel, and the martin. And I'll show you a little bit about each. So the black-backed woodpecker is one that likes burned forests because it comes in and it builds holes and it nests there, and then it provides habitat for other birds like the mountain bluebirds that come in after the fact. It's also at the southern part of its range. So it's really a boreal species, so we're at the warm end of its range. The red squirrel is a key food source for the larger predators, so it's a prey item. It also disperses seeds and fungus, so that can be very important for many organisms, and it acts as a selective force on the lodgepole pine and the whitebark because it preys on their seeds, so it makes the big middens, and it eats a lot of the seeds. And it's very widespread. And then the martin is a good indicator for old growth forests because it likes the old forest, very complex structure. It's one of the ones that's decreasing in the IUCN. It is also quite sensitive to disturbances because it likes that old growth forest. So what Tyler did was basically ask, where are the conditions suitable climatically for these animals because they have certain ranges of temperature that they need to live? And then also, where is the forest or vegetation structure also suitable? And where does that overlap? Because they need both. They gotta have the right climate and they have to have the right vegetation. And so as an example, this is Grand Teton National Park. If we have an area that has lots of forests, so the green here, and then we have a fire, we'll have plenty of habitat for the black-backed woodpecker. If, however, we're later in the century and we don't have very many trees and we have a fire, it doesn't do any good because they need big trees that burn in order to nest or to survive. So just showing you one set of results here for the martin. These are, again, the 5 landscapes. The purple color shows you where you have the climate and the habitat structure both. So historically, for the martin, you'll see there's purple on every one of those landscapes. So the martin can exist in all of those places. If we look at that hot, dry future, you see areas where climate is suitable, but the forest isn't. Or you see areas where the forest is suitable, but the climate isn't. And so for the martin, if we go to the more extreme warming conditions, we will likely lose habitat, both in terms of climate and in terms of forest. So these effects are likely to cascade to other species as well. So in the future, we're looking at areas where the climate and the suitable forests just often don't overlap, so we lose that purple where both of them are suitable. So again, what lies ahead? And how do we kind of get a better understanding of what these graphs and maps mean for the landscapes that we hike in and that we drive through and that we know and love? So this is part of the work that was funded by the Camp Monaco Prize, which also helped us with the simulations to the future, but helping people to understand how Yellowstone might change in the future under these future scenarios. So we have visitors that come from all over the world to the park, and Timon Keller, who's here, one of my PhD students, is leading up this effort. So we know that imagery has been really important. I mean, we have the beautiful museum here of the paintings of the West. I mean, it was so important to the conservation of these areas as, once they were established back in the day. And we also know that imagery is very important for helping us understand the past change. So if any of you have looked at the Bridger Teton photo retake projects, it's really cool. They have photo points where they have historical photos and they've gone back and retaken them. So here you can see, maybe this was a fire in the past, I don't know. You can see the change in the forest from 1911 to 2018. Here's another one from 1910 to 2018. Not quite as much change, but you can get a sense of how the landscape has changed over the historical past. Well, we think that that can help you understand how things might change in the future. So if you take what we've learned from our field studies and our modeling studies for the future, and we take areas that people visit now, so here's the Upper Geyser Basin, as Timon photographed it in 2022. If we take that hot, dry future, then this is what this might look like. We might lose the forest that's in the background behind the hot springs. If we have the carbon emissions under control by mid-century, we'll still see change. I mean, this landscape will still change. Some of that is ingrained right now, but not to such a great degree. Similarly, we go down to the Tetons and we take a look at Mount Moran now, and we think about what might that look like in the future if we have the warming and the fire that I've talked about. We're looking at something like this. The mountain's still there, but the vegetation changes a lot, and perhaps less so if we have less warming and not that dry increase in aridity in the future. So we're working on that now, wondering whether the typical past, so this is up on Dunraven Pass, where these little trees that came back after the 1988 fires are doing fine, whether we're looking at a typical future now. And of course, we'll continue trying to understand why and where and how, and think about that for the future. But our work suggests that forests of Greater Yellowstone are going to decline to some level after the middle part of the century. Trees are going to start having more trouble than they've had in the past, rebounding after fire. So those 1988 fires are kind of becoming our benchmark against which we can assess change in the future. We'll have less forest. The remainder will be patchier, it'll be younger, it'll be sparser. We have some changes in species, but some are winners and some are losers, and in some places we'll still have forests, it'll just be of a different type. However, it's not going to be a monolith. It's going to be variable across our landscape. I think we're going to see more resilience in the more rugged terrain, but again, that will remain to be seen. And we do know that changes will cascade to other species, and these are questions that scientists, our group, but as many others, are really grappling with right now. So I would like to also, though, remind us all that Greater Yellowstone is still going to be a treasure, both to us nationally as the US and world citizens, but also as a scientific treasure. We have learned so much from it. We've had a lot of surprises, and I anticipate we'll still gain that in the future. But I know it's going to still be a source of inspiration to all of us. So with that, I will stop now, and I thank you very much again for coming out this afternoon and being here to share some science. So thank you.
So if there are any questions, I'll run around with a mic. We just ask you to speak in the mic so that folks on Zoom can hear. I'm going to turn on the lights so we can see you all.
Hi, Dr. Turner. Welcome back to the center. So my question was, I'm interested in when you did the pan over of the forest that is not regenerating, but it's regenerating and lower, is there a relation with the snowpack and with more storms coming through and melting the snowpack? Does that have an effect on the seedlings and their ability to sprout?
I don't think it does. So the paper from that work was just published this year. It was led by Kristen Brzeziunas, who is a recent PhD graduate from my lab. But she explored a variety of different climate conditions, including moisture availability and snowpack and things like that, to see if it does explain it. And there's not much of an effect there. So good question. Yes. Yep, that's the big driver.
My question is, in a lot of the southern states, we do a lot of replanting for the pine. Could this be done in some of those areas, whether it's crews coming in with the pickaxe and doing it, or aerial regeneration?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think in the Greater Yellowstone, one of the advantages that we have is that there's different ownerships and different abilities to implement different kinds of management. So that has come up for whether or not we should, and I'm not saying we should, but if we're on, say, national forest lands where we're multiple use, we're not wilderness, might we want to consider bringing ponderosa pine, for example, into this area where climatically it will be suitable, and maybe we should be planting for the future versus the past? Those are discussions that are happening now. I would argue in the wilderness areas or the national parks, I'd probably say no, because I feel like we have such an opportunity to learn from how nature is adapting to these changes, and that will help us inform what we do in our managed areas. But again, this is such a big area that I think there's opportunity for some of those experiments on the forests or on private lands.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
So the trees that we're seeing as we drive west from Cody into Yellowstone, and you begin to enter the park and you enter some of these burned areas, and we're seeing some regeneration happening there. The height of those trees, are they stunted, or is this the age of the tree? You mentioned a lodgepole pine, maybe 200 years old. So are we expecting that these trees will reach historic heights, or are there other factors involved that could result in stunted growth of a stunted forest?
That's a really good question, Corey, and I really don't know, to be honest. Right. I mean, trees grow bigger when they have the right temperature and more water, and they don't grow so much when they're drought conditions. So we know that from the tree rings. The rings will be really teeny in drought years, and then they spread out. And also, if you thin the forest, like if bark beetles come through and they take out your big trees, your little ones will start growing a lot. So if we face drought every summer, I can't imagine the trees would reach their historical heights. But we won't know for a while. The other thing I was going to say is when you're saying going west towards Yellowstone, so from Cody along the Shoshone. So I didn't comment on this. We've done a lot of work on the bark beetles as well. But as you're driving towards the east entrance, on the right side of the road, so that would be the north side of the road, where the gun barrel fire from 2008 burned, that's an interesting area because the bark beetles had been through there just recently. We're still outbreaking at that point in Douglas fir. Douglas fir doesn't have those special cones. It needs to have live trees and seed to come in. So we had bark beetles killing the Douglas firs, and then we had fire come through, and we didn't have a seed source. So there, the only place that you're getting tree regeneration is if you're right near a live tree or a green edge. And then it's also really hot and dry. I was telling my students driving through the last time I was here in Cody and I was driving to the museum, it was 99 degrees. And I had stopped because I thought, oh, maybe I'll hike up one of these drainages and see what the trees are doing. I was like, no, I'm by myself. It's 99 degrees. I might die out here or whatever. But that's an area where there's two disturbances interacting plus a hot, dry climate. But that one is a little bit different there, and there's not a lot of lodgepole. Sorry, that may be a little bit more than you cared to know. But.
That's fantastic. Another question I have, if you can flip back to trying to describe the slides, you had the examples of the warm and dry, and then the graphs of fire, I think it was frequency, and then regeneration was in a red line. It was black and red line graphs.
Yeah.
Under the more modest model that was I think it was the RCP 4.5, the regeneration, forest regeneration was much more, keep going, much more reduced. Sorry, it was a ways back, but it stuck out. And I just was curious as to why we saw, yes. So that top right quadrant scenario, forest stand replacement was almost flatlined under that hot condition, but in a wet scenario. Why would, I'm just out of curiosity, why would we see more stand replacement in a dry, hot scenario versus a wet, hot scenario?
Oh, that's a good question. So when it's wet, you just don't get the fuels drying out enough to have the fires burn. So you just don't get as much fire ignition and spread with the wet summers, even though it gets warmer, because this is a really wet climate model for the future, so it really overcompensates for the increase in temperature. In the dry conditions, it's a little hard to see here, but the stand replacing fire, so the severity of the fire actually peaks mid-century while we still have a lot of forest on the landscape. And then area burned continues to increase, but the stand replacing fire does not, because we don't have the trees to kill the whole forest again. Does that help? Okay. But this is just showing fire, not the forest.
Instead of me hogging the mic, if anybody else has questions.
Have any of you seen what, oh, go ahead. I was going to start asking you folks questions, but that's not fair.
Dr. Turner, let's say for some odd reason, a joint session of Congress has asked you to come make a presentation, and you want to get 3 points across to them. What do you think those points would be regarding climate change and the views of the forested landscapes?
That's a very good question. I would say one is the climate will continue to get warmer and for our area drier for the next couple of decades, and so we need to be prepared for that. Second is if we would like to see it not be as extreme as it could be, if we want to try to minimize the pain, then we really need to work on getting the atmospheric carbon concentrations under control. The third thing is fire cannot always be stopped. And so fires, you can stop low severity fires, and in the Southwest where ponderosa pine was accustomed to burning every 5 years or so, frequent fire, low severity, the trees are adapted to withstand fire. There you can thin the fuels. You can also stop a fire if it's at low severity. But we have to be prepared for some of these that we're not going to be able to stop. The ones in Canada are wonderful examples. This is 1988 on steroids, really, but they won't go out until rain or snow puts them out. So I think we need to both prepare and also acknowledge that there will be change in the future, and we should be dealing with it now to minimize the pain, but ultimately we have to control the carbon dioxide concentrations. I don't know how well that message will be received, but I think that's what I'd emphasize.
So you had a chart, two charts for kind of a currentish and a projected moisture availability. What are the characteristics? Is it rivers, precipitation, humidity?
That's a good question. So it's where it says a wetter future, it's precipitation, and then we focused especially on the summer, but the annual trends are the same. So it would be both snowfall and rainfall, but it's especially the rainfall in the summer that really matters. We have not looked at the consequences for the rivers and the streams, but those are also, I hate to pun, but downstream consequences of the changes in the forest and in the fire. I mean, many of you know that fishing was prohibited from a number of our rivers in the past couple of years because the water temperatures got too hot. And again, if the forest cover is lost, a lot of those streams depend on the shade, not the big rivers, but depending on the shade, and so there will be consequences there as well. So there is actually quite a bit of work focused now on understanding these kinds of dynamics for the hydrologic regime. So for snowfall, where it accumulates, how much snowpack there is, how much ablation there is of the snow, how the timing of the melt. And I mean, last summer, right? The floods in Yellowstone, so a huge amount of snow, and then rain on snow events with more rain than we get. But it was in one day, it was like double the June rainfall, I believe. So, I mean, there's a lot of work going on to try to understand those dynamics. And I would say that the temperature is easier to get at scientifically. The precipitation patterns are really much more complex. In Yellowstone, however, the snowpack is already, I forget the actual percentage, but the snowpack since 1950 is down substantially. So that's changing runoff amounts. And then the timing, of course, is still going to vary from year to year, but there's concern about how hot and how dry. Again, I think we still have more questions sometimes than answers for some of how this will play out.
Dr. Turner, thank you for your time and expertise.
Yeah, thank you. You're welcome. Thanks for coming.